Hi, everyone.
Greetings. We are in the last chapter of Genesis, chapter 50, the death of Joseph. There's only 5 verses to go, but they're so rich in implications and promises that we will make 2 videos out of these 5 verses.
Okay. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the 3rd generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt.
Yeah, I think maybe there's some puzzlement here if you're reading it and taking the word brothers seriously. Mm-hmm. How is it that he's telling his brothers he's dying when they're all older than he is? Well,
that does happen.
That does happen. You were saying the Gibb family, for instance, the Bee Gees,
Yeah.
right? The youngest died first.
Yeah.
And it looks like something like this is happening in Egypt, because 110 years looks marvelous to us, but if you look at Exodus chapter 6, read the genealogy of Moses in Exodus chapter 6, and you realize, oh, they're living 130 years. This is after Joseph. Mm. And therefore his 110 years is actually a shorter lifespan. Mm-hmm. And Moses, of course, lives 120 years, and his brother and sister do too. So, no, Joseph is comparatively short by the standards of not only his ancestors, Abraham and Isaac, and Jacob, but even by later standards. So, yeah, it could be his literal brothers that he's talking to, or it could be his extended family, probably both.
Yeah.
And then you realize, okay, well, what is his hope? And you could take the book of Genesis pessimistically and say, well, it goes from creation to coffin, from paradise to prison in its trajectory. But at the end, Joseph, like Jacob, who's just died, he died a few years before this, quite a few years before this, but we skip from Jacob's death and promises to Joseph's death here in one chapter.
And they both show that same confidence in God's promises are going to happen.
Yeah.
They're not going to stay in Egypt forever.
No. And this has implications for today. I mean, yeah, it looks outwardly like Israel is, even then, hundreds of years in a foreign land, and yet the promises before had been that they would live in this land, the promised land, forever.
Yeah.
So he could have lost hope.
Yeah, he's relying, and especially with the behavior of people, you can get discouraged. So he's not relying on the purity and goodness of his brethren. He's relying on God. God keeps his promises.
Yeah, that hope has been fanned and is kept alive in Joseph as it was in Jacob, despite outward circumstances.
And he even makes them promise to take his bones with them.
Again, like Jacob.
Yeah.
So what's that about, except that the hope is not just a vague hope, it is already aligned with the land and the resurrection, a physical resurrection. Mm-hmm. And then you realize, well, in Christian history and in JW theology, what you have in effect is a replacement theology. Let's just take the JW model, which is that the anointed are spiritual Israel, the 144,000 spiritual Israelites. Yeah. Do they have the hope that's related to the bones and the promised land? No, they don't. So the hope of Israel is clearly an earthly hope. And you have ironically taken the hope of literal Israel, that is the literal descendants of Jacob. You have taken that hope and you've turned it into another thing, which is actually a version of the
replacement theology.
Christendom's hated doctrines, of which we would identify collectively as replacement theology, meaning the church has replaced Israel.
Yeah.
But the hope of the resurrection is clear here, even if it's still kind of indistinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then there's then there's I think the miracle that it's God who's doing this. It's not outward circumstances. Jacob's life was tough. He often seems to despair and fear. Fear seems to characterize him to the end of his life, but Joseph is not like that. Yeah. Despite his terrible ordeal that he had to endure until he was about 30 years old,
he still has confidence that God will keep that promise. And there's probably more people that are like his father had been all along until the end than there are Josephs. So we look at outside circumstances and then we make a judgment. But it's only based on our time and what we see right before us.
Yeah.
That's a lack of confidence in God, that he can keep his promises, that it can be fulfilled. We have to try and work it out in our own head and see it in circumstances that it'll work out.
And frankly, that's what happened in the history of Christendom, that around the year 400 AD, when the Roman Empire was falling and fell, it didn't look like their expectation, which regarding the earth, regarding the restoration of the Jews, etc., the conversion of the nation of Israel. It didn't look like any of this could happen.
So you start using human reasoning and think, well, how can we make this work even though it's not working?
Yeah.
By taking it for ourselves.
No,
and
the
say,
kingdom
well, it's
now.
spiritual. It's about us.
So the kingdom now that you have in the Watchtower course is since 1914. But the kingdom now in Christendom was, okay, we now are in control of the Roman Empire or its remnants. So you can understand why that doctrine lasted so long, really up to the last 200 years. Most Christians across the planet were still thinking this way. But then things started to change outwardly, and suddenly millions of Christians are starting to think, well, maybe the promises will be fulfilled. Yeah. Well, it surely didn't look that way for about 1,400 years.
To the reality of our sinfulness as people.
Yeah. Species of unbelief.
Yeah.
Here's what Alexander Maclaren has to say about this. And incomplete as his creed was, Joseph may have been a better Christian than some of us. And was so if what he knew nourished his spiritual life more than what we know nourishes ours, and if his heart and will twined more tenaciously round the fragments of revelation which he possessed, and drew from them more support and strength than we do from the complete gospel which we have. And then he says, let us always remember that it is not the amount of religious knowledge which I have got, but the amount which I use that determines my religious position and character. Most of us have in our creeds principles that have no influence upon our moral and active life. And if so, it matters not one whit how pure, how accurate, how comprehensive, how consistent, how scriptural my conceptions of the gospel may be. If they are not powers in my soul, they only increase my responsibility and my liability to condemnation. Ooh.
Strong words.
And you have Nahum Sarna, right, which is a Jewish commentator.
So he makes this point. Another item of interest to Egyptologists is the age of Joseph at his death. For 110 years was considered to be the ideal lifespan in ancient Egypt. This notion is exemplified by the words of one vizier, is that how you say it? Vizier? Yeah. Who writes, what I have done on earth is not inconsiderable. I attained 110 years of life. We could wish, eh? So far, no less than 27 such references to this ideal age limit has been noted in Egyptian texts.
Wow, and that's a generation ago, so maybe they found more by now. Yeah. But it shows you that whoever wrote Genesis, and there was a fashion for generations among so-called liberal commentators to think that it was written 1,000 years after the supposed events. Whoever wrote Genesis obviously knows the Egyptian culture of that age.
Yeah. Good.
What are our links?
We're going to link to a series that I did on hope, the continuity of prophecy. We'll put the first one in, and you can just follow the links. And the second is our videos from the playlist on Sappher's book, which is called
The Divine Unity of Scripture.
So the first one was called This Book Opened the Eyes of Two JWs. That's us. Yahweh's Unchangeable Promises and Continuity of the Bible. So again, just keep following the links.
See you next time.
Bye.